Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk you through my approach to answering paper 3 in Cambridge's A-level English language, particularly the moves for the directed writing response, as well as my approach to comparing and contrasting my directed writing response to the transcript of the text B. I'm going to just talk you through my thinking, my approach to planning, my approach to this passage. We're working with this one from Fawlty Towers from winter 2018. So if you haven't read it already, have a read and think through how you would answer part A. You can pause here, read the passage and think through or write the letter. But once you've done that, I'm going to take you over to how I would do the letter. Remember, you always want to use the GRASP method, GRASPP. What's the genre, the register, the audience, the style, the purpose, and the point of view? In this case, to do well in this 10-mark question, you really want to authentically embody the persona, right? What would actually go into a formal letter of complaint? Some of you want to have the register appropriate, you want the language to be appropriate, you don't want to be snide or sarcastic because you are asking for a refund, right? So there has to be some degree of politeness and propriety, right? You can't be rude if you're trying to get a refund. So some of the letters that I read were a bit, over the top in the sassy comments, if you will, or the rhetorical questions. So just I guess be careful with that. So this is the letter I wrote. You can pause and read it. I'll show you one or two other student examples, and then we'll compare how the language. Again, here's the question: compare how the language and the style of your complaint function against the language and style of the conversation. So my approach to this question is I think in tables, right? Once I've written mine, I'm reminded of this graphic from Get Revising that talks about the different ways of grouping texts, right? Who is the text for? What's its purpose? What type of text it is? What register do we see in both texts and why? What kind of language do we see non-stat in English? If so, why? We have to be descriptivist. What family of words do we see? In other words, what semantic fields or lexical fields do we see? Do we see jargon? If it's spoken, one text is spoken, what are the features of spoken language that we see, and why? So the key thing with this paper, especially the compare and contrast, is not only to identify the lexical property, the feature of language and style, you also want to find apt evidence and then explain its function. Be descriptivist in explaining its function vis-a-vis the purpose of the text or the context of the text or the audience. So why is this feature there, right? So this is one way of grouping. And what I just made a simple table when I thought about the transcript and the letter. And I sort of thought about, okay, what's the purpose of these texts? Who's the audience? What register am I seeing? What's the tone of the two texts? So now I'm up to 4 points, almost 4 paragraphs. Do I see low or high frequency lexis? What features of the spoken language stand out, and how does that compare? And I noticed, not so much in terms of sentence structures, but I noticed the use of modal verbs having some similarities. And in terms of other features, figurative language, I noticed that there's a particular rhetorical strategy or literary device that's used in one text, the transcript, that's not in the other. So these are the things that I'm going to compare. So I'm going to just talk you through how I would write a body paragraph. The introduction is like this. You can pause and read, but I try to keep your introductions just short, right? Just what is the context of these two texts? In this case, I mentioned that they center around Mrs. Richards' experience, but I do note that very quickly that text A is a scripted conversation for a TV show that's meant to be comedic and sarcastic, and text B is a letter of complaint, written mode for a specific audience, so it varies largely in tone and style. I think that's all you need to do in your introduction. Frame the main area of connection and the key areas of divergence, and then the bulk of your work is deconstructing that according to this table over here. So let me just talk you through a couple of them. Right, you can see that my notes for the register are already done here. So the letter has to adopt the formal register. I need to find particular evidence from my letter, right, and explain why would I adopt this formality. I don't know this person that I'm writing to, but I'm writing for a request. It's a formal letter. It's a formal document. That's why the register makes sense. Text B is going to be semi-formal, right? Although there is formality between the interlocutors, Mr. Basil and Mrs. Richards, there is some informality because it is a TV show after all. It is meant to entertain. It's going to a broad audience. It's comedy. It's scripted, right? So and it's a dialogue between people, and so you wouldn't have that strict degree of formality, right? So in that paragraph that I've just articulated there, notice how I've made my point. I would have had specific evidence. I didn't mention it there, but then the key thing is explaining the function, the impact, the function of these lexical properties in the passage. Then I'll move on to the tone, right? I notice that the letter has a serious and authoritative tone, right? Where's my evidence for that? Well, what particular textual details can I extract to show a serious and authoritative tone? And then why? I am a disgruntled customer trying to get my money back. I need to relay the gravity of my grievance, and I need to sound sure of myself. Whereas the tone, the attitude of the speaker is much of the whole passage. The script is much more humorous and much more sarcastic. So you can point to Basil's side comments there, and you can talk you can explain why the comedy is built in there. Another thing I might point out, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just talking you through. I notice when I'm thinking about modal verbs, I notice in my letter, text A, the person says, I cannot accept this. What's the exact paragraph? Is yeah, I cannot be expected. So there's surety, there's an authoritativeness there, right? High modal, high modality, if you like. Whereas there's more measured modality in the passage. The may I ask, may I suggest. There's some politeness by Basil, one of the interlocutors, and that might be because in the context of the text, he's a hotel manager trying to stay sympathetic, trying to stay understanding, contrasted with Mrs. Richards, right, who's much more commanding, right? I will not do this. I want a room with a bath. So I hope that helps you clarify what you're looking for in your paragraphs. I want you to keep this in mind. This is from our textbook Golden Ranking, right? Using these these words for comparison, right? You're finding both similarities and explanations, right? So while text A does this, or unlike in text B, unlike in the transcript, we see a lot more humor, right? Similarly, we see Mrs. Richards adopt the high modality that we see in the transcript. So using this language to find points of comparison and find points of contrast. So now I want to show you just a couple of more student examples. So here's an entry from a student. Let me just zoom out to make it a bit clearer. You can pause and read this entry, but if I was using this as a text, in green I've put what stands out in terms of the language and style of this particular entry is the adjectives, right? The very detestable, despicable, forsaken, dismal, horrendous, perilous. There's a thread there, right? There's a particular use of these adjectives that are around discomfort, that are sort of in the lexical field of discomfort or horror, really aghast, right? In this letter, but you don't see that degree of aghastness, if I can say that, in the transcript, right? So why is this there? Again, this person is trying to be authoritative, trying to be serious, trying to be commanding, trying to trying to get their money back by making an argument, a strong argument, and therefore the strong adjectives that echo and articulate how frustrated she was. Right, these are all quite quite negative adjectives, to say the least. When we talk about the modality, we can see how the author clearly says, I cannot, I will not, right? Very sure of themselves, very, very sure of themselves. And what does that show? Again, you link it to the context. This little drawing here is another way you might want to plan, right? And you think about the genre, audience, purpose, mind the gap for text A, mind the gap for text B. What are the 6 or 7 points you have there? And you're always moving in between, right? What does this tone have to do with the genre, audience, and purpose in A, and why might it be different, or how might it connect to what I see in text B? So you're always moving in between and doing an integrated analysis, right? You're always thinking about, when I see something, I explain it in the vis-a-vis the purpose or the audience or the genre. Why does it make sense given the genre or audience or purpose, and how does this compare to what I see in text B? Is there a similarity? In which case I'll use one of my words. Likewise, similarly, so too does text B, or is there a difference? In contrast, however, on the contrary, what have you? Right, so these are what's different about this is that we've got adjectives that we can zoom in on. And then finally, another student entry, you can pause and read it here. I think the new technique that isn't in the other two letters is the use of rhetorical questions that I've put in orange here. So again, we read the questions. What sort of establishment are you running here? So why am I paying for it? There's much more of an accusatory tone there, much more. That's the function of these rhetorical questions, right? They're really probing and pointing and speaking to Mrs. Faulty and asking her why, right? And so there the persona is an aggrieved customer, right? Where you don't and then you can compare that. Similarly, in text A, in the transcript, we see Mrs. Richards with the same sort of authoritative, demanding demeanor and persona, right? So that's where you can see a point of comparison between the two. So I've shown you three different examples of the directed writing response. I've shown you a couple of ways you can approach planning, right, with these bubbles and with this table. And I've shown you some language you should be using to move in between. The big point here is make sure you're treating each text about equally 50-50 and 50-50, and you are thinking about why, the function in the text. Be descriptivist, right? Why is this thing there? Why is its function there, right? So if we don't see, under this point of features of spoken language, if we don't see many non-fluency features, well, it's a scripted conversation, right? Although there are moments in which it feels a little bit more organic, it feels, there's overlaps, there's a bit uncooperative, but we also see turn taking, right? So you explain why those happen, and then you contrast it to the written text, which is a different mode, obviously, and is much more structured. So hopefully this helps you review approaches. Do this yourself. Fill out this table. I encourage you to write some sample paragraphs or write the full essay just to practice moving in between the two texts, making a point, finding apt evidence, explaining it, and then using these to link your ideas together. The link in the PEEL format comes from using these. And then your goal is 7 hearty paragraphs, and that's your road to an A star.